The sirens on the Ethelgard hub did not scream. They hummed a low, bone-shaking frequency that made the fillings in my teeth ache. It was a polite, high-tech way of saying we were all about to be vaporized. I was waist-deep in a conduit trench in Sector 9, my hands slick with synthetic coolant, and the kind of grime that only a decade of chasing sparks can earn you. My cortex link was buzzing against the base of my skull, a frantic staccato of error codes that smelled like burnt ozone and impending unemployment. "Move it, Vance," a voice barked through my comms. It was Chief Miller, a man whose soul had been replaced by a maintenance manual 40 years ago. "We have a localized breach in the resonance lab. High Arbiter Vaughn is still inside. If that singularity loses its grip, the whole ring goes dark." I wiped a smear of grease across my forehead, leaving a dark streak. "Copy that, Chief. I am already on my way. Tell the brass to keep their shirts on. I am just a wrench turner, not a miracle worker." I scrambled out of the trench, grabbing my heavy-duty toolkit. My boots clattered against the phasing fabric of the floor, which was currently flickering a panicked shade of crimson. In the Ethelgard hub, everything was designed to be beautiful, even the death traps. I ignored the shimmering viewports that showed the swirling violet dust of the veils outside. Space was a graveyard for people who spent too much time looking at the scenery. I reached the reinforced doors of Lab 9 and slammed my override key into the terminal. The magnetic locks groaned, fighting against the internal pressure of the room. When the seal finally hissed open, a cloud of iridescent gas billowed out, smelling of ancient libraries and lightning. Through the haze, I saw her. Elara Vaughn was standing in the center of the chamber, her hands dancing through a holographic web of gold and silver threads. Her skin, usually a calm, translucent sapphire, was pulsating with a frantic, jagged rhythm of amber and violet. That was the thing about the Ethel. They could lie with their voices, but their skin was a goddamn mood ring that never missed a beat. "Arbiter!" I shouted, my voice muffled by my rebreather mask. "We have to bug out. The containment field is flatlining." She did not turn. Her long, crystalline ears were pinned flat against her skull, a sign of absolute, terrifying focus. "Kaelen," she whispered, and even through the chaos, her voice carried that melodic, multi-tonal quality that made my human vocal cords feel like a rusted hinge. "The lattice is reflecting. It is not an error. It is a response." I did not care about the science. I cared about the fact that the floor was starting to vibrate at a frequency that suggested reality was getting thin. I lunged forward, grabbing her by the waist. She felt cold, like smooth marble heated by a distant sun. Her skin flared a bright, shocking crimson at my touch, a color I had never seen on an Ethel before. "Let go!" I yelled, dragging her toward the exit. "We do not have time for a physics lesson." As we stumbled into the corridor, a massive surge of energy rippled through the lab behind us. The sound was not an explosion. It was a hungry, hollowed-out silence that sucked the air from my lungs. The blast door slammed shut, sealing the void behind us, but the shock wave threw us both against the far wall. I hit the deck hard, my vision swimming with silver spots. For a second, the world was just the smell of her ozone-scented skin and the frantic thrumming of two hearts. I looked down, and Elara was staring at me, her amethyst eyes wide, her skin settled into a soft, glowing azure that felt like a warm embrace in the dark. "You are injured," she said, her fingers reaching out to touch a cut on my cheek. Her touch sent a jolt of static through my cortex link that had nothing to do with the machinery. "Just a scratch," I grunted, trying to find my feet. "I have had worse from a faulty toaster. You okay, Elara?" She nodded slowly, her ears twitching in a way that suggested she was processing a billion calculations at once. "I am intact, Kaelen, but the experiment, it saw you." I wiped my face and looked at her, really looked at her. In this light, she did not look like a high arbiter of the Ethelgard. She looked like someone who had just seen the edge of the universe and realized it was smaller than she thought. "Whatever," I said, offering her a hand. "Let's just get to the med bay before Chief Miller decides to dock my pay for the door I just broke." As we walked down the flickering corridor, I could not shake the feeling that the static between us had just become a permanent signal. The first time I met Elara Vaughn, I was covered in the hydraulic fluid of a Type 6 lifter, and swearing at a strip bolt that was older than my career. It was 6 months ago, back when I thought the Ethelgard hub was just another paycheck in a long line of hollow victories. Maintenance technician Vance, a voice had asked, sounding like a flute played in a cathedral. I had looked up from the grease in the metal to see a vision of perfection that had no business being in a loading bay. She was wearing a flowing gown made of silver fibers that seemed to drift in a wind that did not exist. Her skin was a pale, shimmering teal, the color of a shallow ocean on a planet I had long since forgotten. "That is what it says on the badge," I said, wiping my hands on a rag that was more dirt than fabric. "You lost, Arbiter? The ivory towers are 3 levels up." "I am not lost," she replied, her ears perking up with a curiosity that felt almost invasive. "I am searching for the man who repaired the environmental regulator in the hydroponics wing, the one who used a piece of discarded copper wire to bypass the logic gate." I shrugged, leaning against the lifter. The official parts were stuck in a freighter near the belt. I had to make it work. Plants do not care about protocol, they just want to breathe. She stepped closer, her skin shifting into a soft, inquisitive green. "It was a brilliant, chaotic solution," she said. "My people would have waited for the correct component, even if the flora perished. Efficiency is often the enemy of survival." "I am Kaelen," I said, finally dropping the defensive act. "And you are Dr. Vaughn, the one who plays with gravity." "I am Elara," she corrected, "and I do not play with gravity. I attempt to understand the threads that hold it together." Over the next few weeks, I started getting more calls to Sector 9 than was strictly necessary. A flickering light here, a humming ventilator there. Each time I would show up with my toolkit and she would be there, waiting with a cup of that bitter, highly caffeinated sludge the Ethel called tea. We talked. Not about the war or the hegemony, but about the small things. I told her about Earth, about the way the salt air felt in a place called Maine, and the way the snow sounded when it hit the ground on a silent night. She told me about the Ethel homeworld, a place of crystalline spires where every emotion was mapped out and categorized before a child could even speak. "Your world sounds lonely," I had said one night while I was recalibrating her lab's sensors. "Loneliness is a human concept, Kaelen," she replied, her skin a neutral, disciplined gray. "We prefer the term optimal focus. To be alone is to be without distraction." "Liar," I muttered, not looking up from my work. "Your ears are drooping. That means you are sad, or bored." "I am betting on sad." She had gone silent then, her skin flaring a quick, startled violet before she regained control. "You are far too observant for a technician," she said softly. The memories of those quiet hours felt like a dream as I sat in the med bay, watching a robotic arm stitch up the gash on my arm. Elara was sitting on the edge of the next bed, her silver gown torn and blackened by the blast. "The Hegemony will want a report," she said, her voice sounding tired. "They will ask why the containment failed." "Tell them the truth," I said. "The equipment is old, the power grid is a joke, and we are all overworked." "No," she whispered, looking at me with those amethyst eyes that seemed to see right through my cortex link. "The containment failed because the resonance lattice was searching for a tether. It found one in your biological signature." I laughed, a dry, harsh sound. "I am a spark chaser, Elara. I am as biological as a brick. There is nothing in me for a machine to find." She reached out, her cool fingers brushing the back of my hand. "There is a frequency in you, Kaelen, a jagged, beautiful noise that defies every equation I have ever written. You call it grief, perhaps, or hope, but to the lattice, it is the only thing that is real." I pulled my hand away, the old fear of being known, of being seen, clawing at my chest. "I have to go," I said, standing up too fast. "I have shifts to cover, people to report to." "Kaelen," she called out as I reached the door. I stopped but did not turn. "Why did you come back for me? The sensors showed the room was already compromised. You could have stayed in the corridor." I stood there for a long moment, the hum of the station vibrating in the soles of my boots. I did not have a good answer, not one that did not involve admitting that the empty space in my life was suddenly shaped exactly like her. "I forgot my favorite wrench," I lied. I could feel her skin glowing behind me, a soft, amused sapphire that followed me all the way back to the dark, lonely tunnels of Sector 9. The air in the sub-level maintenance crawl space was thick enough to chew on. It was a cocktail of recycled oxygen, scorched wiring, and the lingering, sweet metallic scent of ethyl energy discharge. I had been tucked into this metal coffin for 4 hours, my back screaming in protest against the jagged edges of the hull plating. My cortex link was running hot, sending a dull, pulsing ache through my jaw every time I tried to sync with the primary coolant valves. Kaelen, you are pushing the synchronization beyond safety parameters. Elara's voice came through the local comms, clear as a bell and twice as sharp. I can feel the feedback loop in the lattice. It is vibrating like a dying star. Relax, Elara, I grunted, wiping a bead of sweat away from my eye with a grease-stained sleeve. I've been wrestling with these rust buckets since before you could calculate a light curve. This valve just needs a little bit of tactical persuasion. I swung a heavy-duty mag wrench, the magnetic pulse thudding into the stubborn coupling. The vibration hummed through my arm, rattling my teeth. Finally, the valve groaned and turned, releasing a hiss of pressurized nitrogen that coated the floor in a layer of white frost. There, I said, leaning back and ignoring the spasm in my lumbar. Flow is restored. You should see the pressure normalize in about 3 minutes. Maybe now the Hegemony suits will stop breathing down my neck for 24 hours. I crawled out of the vent, emerging into the dim, amber-lit alcove where Elara stood. The auxiliary lab was a mess of hanging cables and flickering holographic displays, a temporary sanctuary from the prying eyes of the station's oversight committees. Elara was hovering over a portable resonator, her long, elegant fingers tracing patterns in the air. Her skin was a translucent, shimmering turquoise tonight, the color of a winter sky back on Earth, though the edges of her ears were tinted with a nervous, pulsing indigo. You did not have to assist me with this, she said, her voice dropping to a low, melodic register. This repair was not on the official docket. If Chief Miller finds out you are diverting resources to my research, the fallout will be significant. Miller is a gearhead who couldn't find his own backside in a well-lit hangar, I said, tossing the wrench into my kit. Besides, your research is the only thing on this station that doesn't feel like a slow walk toward a cold grave. The lattice is important. Elara turned to me, her skin shifting to a soft, vulnerable lavender. It is not just about the science, Kaelen. Since the breach, the lattice has been different. It does not just record data anymore. It records intent. It is looking for the emotional resonance that stabilized the field during the collapse. She stepped closer. Her presence, that strange, heavy atmospheric pressure that Ethel projected when they were focused, washing over me. I could feel the static on my skin, the way her proximity made my own heartbeat feel like a foreign object. The Hegemony wants to weaponize it, she whispered. They think it is a new form of long-range jamming. But it is not. It is a bridge. And you, Kaelen Vance, are the anchor. Every time you are near, the equations stabilize. My people call it the unquantifiable variable. I call it a miracle. I felt that old familiar itch to run. When things got too real, when the air got too thick with things I couldn't fix with a wrench, I usually made a break for the nearest airlock or the bottom of a bottle. But looking at her with her glowing skin and those eyes that held the weight of a dozen galaxies, I couldn't move. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the distant, rhythmic throb of the station's primary engines. I felt the weight of her words, the terrifying implication that I was more than just a bystander in her world. I had to break it. I had to find a way back to the mundane, to the safety of the shallow end. I let out a short, dry chuckle and leaned against a flickering console. A bridge, huh? And here I thought I was just the guy who kept your lights on. You keep talking like that, Elara, and I'm going to start thinking you love me. It was a joke, a classic Vance deflection, a bit of street slang flirtation I'd picked up in the dives of New Brooklyn, meant to elicit a laugh or a roll of the eyes. I expected her to tilt her head in that confused scholarly way of hers and ask for a definition of love in a three-dimensional context. But the laugh didn't come. Elara froze. Her skin didn't just change color, it erupted. A wave of deep, burning crimson washed over her from her throat to the tips of her ears, followed immediately by a shimmering electric violet that made her glow like a sun going supernova. Her ears, usually so disciplined, flared wide and began to quiver with an intensity that seemed almost painful. She set the resonator down with a shaky hand, the metal clattering against the deck. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by the sheer force of her reaction. She turned to me, her amethyst eyes wide and shining with a raw, terrifying honesty that stripped me bare. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a breath, a fragile trill of sound that broke the silence like glass. "How did you know?" she whispered. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a deflection. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the moment the floor fell away and left me drifting in the void without a tether. Elara, I was just kidding," I stammered, my hands feeling useless at my sides. "It was a joke. You know, human banter? I didn't mean—" "I have been trying to conceal it for 3 months," she interrupted, her voice gaining a desperate, rhythmic cadence. 3 months of calculating the risks, of modeling the cultural fallout, of trying to recalibrate my own physiology to ignore the way your presence disrupts my focus. I thought my poker face, as you call it, was sufficient. I thought I had buried the signal beneath the noise of the laboratory. She stepped toward me, her skin now a soft, pulsing indigo that seemed to hum with the same frequency as the lattice. "I am a scientist, Kaelen. I deal in certainties and observable phenomena. But there is no equation for the way I feel when you walk into a room. There is no formula for the way my dual hearts sync to the rhythm of your voice. It is a malfunction of the highest order. I was paralyzed. All the walls I had built since Earth, all the armor I had welded around my heart to keep the grief and the ghosts out, they were melting. The grease, the grime, the simple life of a technician. It all felt like a lie in the face of her truth. "I'm just a guy who fixes things, Elara," I said, my voice rough and barely recognizable. "I'm a broken-down human with a history of making a mess of everything I touch. You're a high arbiter. You're brilliant. You're light. I'm just the shadow. The universe is full of shadows that define the light," she replied, her hand reaching out to touch my chest, right over my thudding heart. "You are not a repairman to me, Kaelen. You are the only thing in this cold, metallic shell that feels real. So tell me, now that the joke is dead, what do we do with the truth?" I looked down at her hand, silken and glowing against my dirty work tunic. The fear was still there, a cold weight in my gut, but for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't the loudest thing in the room. "I think," I whispered, leaning down until our foreheads brushed, "we stopped joking. In that dim, forgotten corner of Ethelgard, amidst the hum of failing machines and the scent of ozone, the unquantifiable variable finally found its answer. But as her lips met mine, I couldn't help but feel the shadow of the station looming over us, a cold reminder that in a world of logic and light, a love like ours was the most dangerous glitch of all. The morning after the auxiliary lab incident felt like waking up after a 10-car pileup. My head was a mess of half-formed thoughts and the lingering electric ghost of Elara's touch. I was back in Sector 7, trying to look busy by scrubbing the carbon scoring off a secondary thruster manifold, but my mind was light years away. I knew the peace wouldn't last. In a place like Ethelgard, secrets didn't stay buried. They just fermented until they blew the pressure seals. "Vance, get your tail up here. Now!" Chief Miller's voice crackled through my cortex link with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He didn't sound angry. He sounded worried. And in my experience, a worried Chief Miller meant the high-level suits were looking for a scapegoat. I dropped the scrubbing brush and wiped my hands on my thighs. "Copy that, Chief. On my way." I made my way toward the obsidian spire, the gleaming black glass heart of the station, where the Hegemony played God with the lives of 12,000 residents. The atmosphere changed the higher I went. The gritty, lived-in smell of the lower decks was replaced by a sterile, filtered air that tasted like nothing at all. The people here wore pristine uniforms and walked with the rigid grace of those who had never had to bleed for a paycheck. When I entered Miller's office, he wasn't alone. Standing by the panoramic viewport was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a block of ice. He wore the charcoal gray suit of a Hegemony peacekeeper, and his eyes were the color of a dying sun. Kaelen Vance, the man said, his voice a smooth, dangerous purr. I am Agent Oris Thorne, Internal Security. I looked at Miller. The old man was staring at his desk, his hands trembling slightly. He wouldn't look me in the eye. That was the first red flag. Is there a problem, Agent? I asked, keeping my voice flat. I'm pretty sure I'm up to date on all my safety certifications. Thorne turned away from the window, his gaze locking onto mine. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the base of my skull, where the cortex link sat. We aren't here about safety, Vance. We are here about anomalies. Specifically, the energy spikes coming out of Lab 9 and the unauthorized repairs in the sublevels. I felt a cold bead of sweat roll down my spine. Just doing my job, I said. Doctor, Vaughn's equipment is temperamental. It needs a lot of TLC to keep it from blowing a hole in the station. Tender, loving care, Thorne repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. An interesting human idiom. But our sensors suggest a different kind of interaction. They suggest a biological synchronicity between you and the Arbiter that should be impossible. He walked toward me, his steps silent on the carpet. You've been spending a lot of time with her, Vance. More than your job description requires. Over 300 hours of unlogged interaction in the last 2 months alone. Tell me, what does a human technician talk about with an ethel physicist for 300 hours? We talk about the weather, I said, a flash of defiance sparking in my gut. Oh, wait, there is no weather in space. We talk about how the Hegemony spends more on silk curtains for the spire than they do on life support for the workers. Thorne didn't blink. Humor is a common defense mechanism for humans when they are under duress. But let's cut the static. The resonance lattice is the most important project on this station. It is the key to instantaneous communication across the veils. And for some reason, it only works when you are in the room. He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne and cold ozone wafting off him. Dr. Van has been summoned for a purity recalibration. Her peers are concerned that her light is contaminated, and you, Vance, are the contaminant. The word hit me like a slap. Contaminant. As if loving someone, as if being human, was a virus that needed to be purged. Where is she? I demanded, my voice dropping an octave. She is being handled, Thorne said, and you are being reassigned. Effective immediately, you are grounded to the fuel depots in Sector 12. No contact with the science wing, no contact with the Arbiter. If you even look at a blueprint of Lab 9, I'll have your cortex link ripped out and toss you into the void without a suit. Do I make myself clear? I looked at Miller again. He finally looked up, his eyes full of a weary, defeated pity. Just go, Kay, he whispered. Don't make it worse. I turned and walked out of the office without another word. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that felt like it could melt the station's hull. They were treating her like a malfunctioning machine, a piece of equipment that needed to be recalibrated because she dared to feel something they couldn't control. I didn't go to Sector 12. I didn't go to my quarters. I headed straight for the waste heat vents in the underbelly of the science wing. It was the only place I knew where the sensors were blinded by the constant thermal wash of the primary reactors. I waited for 2 hours in the sweltering heat, the roar of the vents drowning out everything else. I was about to give up when a shadow detached itself from the darkness near the cooling pipes. Elara stepped into the dim light. She looked diminished. Her skin was a dull, flat gray, the color of ash. Her ears were pinned tight against her head, and her movements were stiff, as if she were fighting against her own body. Kaelen, she whispered, and the sound broke my heart. They put me in the chamber of silence. They tried to filter the resonance. They said my light was fractured. I moved to her, wrapping my arms around her despite the heat. She felt cold, colder than she ever had before. I've got you, Elara. I'm not going anywhere. They are going to take me away, she said, her head resting against my shoulder. They said the experiment is moving to the high citadel on Valanus Prime. They said I am too unstable for Ethelgard. I pulled back, looking at her ashen face. Valanus Prime? That's halfway across the quadrant. It's a fortress. If they get you there, I'll never see you again." "I know," she said, a single shimmering tear, a drop of liquid light, rolling down her cheek. "They told me that if I did not comply, they would decommission you. They called you a variable that needed to be erased." I let out a harsh laugh and kissed her forehead. "Let them try. I'm a spark chaser, remember? I've spent my life fixing things that were supposed to be dead, and I'm not letting them kill this." "But how?" she asked, her skin flickering with a tiny, desperate spark of blue. "We are two people against the hegemony. The odds are—" "Zero," I finished for her. "The odds are zero. But the universe is full of improbabilities, right? You said so yourself." I took her hands in mine, the heat of the vents making the grease on my fingers slick. "We have 30 days before they move you. 30 days to find a way out of this birdcage. I need you to keep playing their game. Be the perfect silent scientist. Let them think they've won. While they're busy recalibrating you, I'm going to be building a back door." She looked at me, the spark in her skin growing brighter, a defiant, electric sapphire that cut through the shadows of the vent. "You would risk everything? Your career, your life, for a woman you barely know from a species that thinks you are a flaw in the system?" I thought about the silence of Maine, the ghosts of Earth, and the way her light felt against my skin. "I'm not risking anything, Elara," I said. "I'm finally choosing something worth keeping." As we stood there in the belly of the station, surrounded by the roar of the machines and the weight of the hegemony's eyes, I realized that the courage she spoke of wasn't about fighting a war. It was about standing in the dark, holding the hand of the only person who made the stars feel close, and being willing to burn up together rather than live in the cold. We had 30 days, 720 hours, 43,200 minutes. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't counting the seconds until my shift ended. I was counting the moments until we were free. The fuel depots of Sector 12 were the closest thing to hell I had ever encountered in the vacuum of space. If the obsidian spire was the station's polished, arrogant face, then Sector 12 was its churning, diseased gut. Down here, the air was heavy with the stench of unrefined H3 fuel, a thick, oily aroma that clung to your skin and tasted like copper and old pennies. The gravity was heavy, set at 110% to keep the volatile sludge from drifting into the ventilation, making every step feel like I was wading through deep mud. I had been here for 6 days and I was already starting to feel like a ghost. Agent Thorne's reassignment was a death sentence for the soul. I spent 14 hours a day monitoring pressure seals on massive, rusted tanks that groaned like dying whales. My coworkers were the dregs of the Ethel Guard, mostly humans with too many debts or Ethel who had malfunctioned in some quiet, shameful way. We didn't talk much. In Sector 12, breath was a commodity you didn't waste on pleasantries. "Vance, watch the damn manifold," a voice barked over the local mesh. I snapped out of my daze, pulling a lever to vent a puff of superheated steam just as the gauge hit the red. My supervisor was a human named Silas, a man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts and bad intentions. He was 62 years old and had spent 40 of those years in the dark. "Sorry, Silas," I muttered, wiping the condensation from my visor. "The sensor must have lagged." "Lagged?" Silas spat, his voice a gravelly mess. "This whole level is lagging. One day these tanks are going to pop, and we're all going to be nothing but grease on the bulkheads. Don't get lazy on me, kid. I don't feel like being KIA because you're dreaming of the upper decks. KIA." It was a joke to him, but down here, it was a constant reality. I checked my internal chronometer. It was 1900 hours. Shift change was in 10 minutes. I had a meeting to keep, and if Thorne's goons caught me, I'd be lucky to end up as bulkhead grease. I waited until the bells chimed for the alpha rotation to end. Instead of heading to the cafeteria for my ration of gray protein mush, I slipped into the shadow of Tank 49. I'd spent the last 4 days mapping the sensor dead zones in this sector. The hegemony was thorough, but they were arrogant. They assumed no one in Sector 12 had the brains or the drive to circumvent their digital net. They didn't count on a spark chaser who had been breaking rules since he was 12 years old. I reached a small reinforced hatch that led to a secondary bypass tunnel. I punched in a code I'd borrowed from Silas's terminal 3 days ago. The hatch hissed open, and I slid inside, the cool air of the maintenance shaft a mercy after the sweltering heat of the depot. I moved through the darkness for 20 minutes, my hands tracing the familiar geometry of pipes and cables. I emerged in a disused observation pod that looked out over the trailing rings of the Ethelgard. The glass was pitted and clouded with age, but it offered a sliver of the stars, the only thing that kept me sane. Kaelen? The voice was a whisper, but it vibrated through the metal of the floor. Elara stepped out from behind a rusted support pillar. She was wearing a heavy, oversized environmental suit meant for a human technician, her long ears tucked awkwardly into the hood. In the dim light, her skin was a pale, flickering amber, the color of a guttering candle. "You're late," she said, her ears perking up just enough to show her relief. I was starting to think the lattice had noticed. "I'm here, Elara," I said, pulling her into a brief, fierce embrace. The suit felt cold and abrasive, but I could feel the thrum of her dual hearts through the fabric. It's getting harder to slip away. Thorne's boys are everywhere. They're checking logs twice a shift. "They are doing more than checking logs, Kaelen," she said, pulling back. Her skin shifted to a sharp, jagged violet. "I found the primary directive for the High Citadel transfer. It's not a research project. It's a deployment." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning against the cold glass of the viewport. "The resonance lattice. It doesn't just record intent, it amplifies it. If they hook it into the station's primary broadcast array, they can project a specific emotional frequency across an entire planetary system. They call it coherent empathy. But it's not empathy, it's a weapon." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the pod. "A weaponized emotion?" "Think about it, Kaelen," she said, her voice rising in a desperate melodic trill. "A whole world of people suddenly feeling the same crushing fear, the same absolute submission, the same blind rage. No shots fired, no cities leveled, just a population that has forgotten how to be anything but what the hegemony wants them to be. And because the signal is rooted in ethel physiology, it's undetectable to standard human neurological scans. I looked out at the stars, suddenly feeling very small and very tired. And they need you to calibrate the final stage. They need my light," she whispered, "my malfunction, my capacity for high-amplitude resonance. They aren't punishing me for loving you, Kaelen. They are using you as the catalyst to sharpen the blade. They know you make my signal stronger. They want us close enough to bleed into each other, but controlled enough to be useful." The realization felt like a punch to the gut. All those hours in Lab 9, all those stolen moments, they hadn't just been watching us, they had been measuring us. They were harvesting our connection to build a cage for the rest of the galaxy. I slammed my fist against the support pillar, the metal ringing out in the quiet pod. God damn them. God damn them all to the void. "Kaelen, listen to me," she said, taking my hands in hers. Her skin was now a steady, defiant blue. "I've started the bypass. I've embedded a logic worm in the lattice's core. It won't stop the broadcast, but it will destabilize the signal if I'm not physically present to maintain the harmony. We have 22 days before the transport ship arrives." I looked at her, her face barely visible beneath the hood of the suit. "We aren't just running for us anymore, are we?" "No," she said softly. "We are running for every soul they intend to silence." I took a deep breath, the smell of ozone and old metal filling my lungs. "Okay." Then we changed the plan. I was going to try and sneak us onto a cargo hauler, but a hauler won't get past the blockade once they realize you're gone. We need something faster, something with a military-grade cloak. "You mean a skip ship?" she said, her ears flattening in apprehension. "The Hegemony keeps those in the high-security berths of Sector 1. It's impossible, Kaelen." "Impossible is just a word people use when they're too scared to look for the override," I said, a grim smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. "I spent 5 years on Earth stealing cars to pay for my sister's medical bills. Stealing a spaceship isn't that much different. You just have to know which wires to cross." "But the cost?" she began, her skin flickering back to that vulnerable lavender. "If we fail, they won't just kill us, they will strip our minds. You will be a meat sack on a fuel line for the rest of your life, and I will be a silent battery for their weapon. I looked at her, really looked at her. I thought about the winter in Maine, the silence of the snow, and the way I had spent 5 years running from the fear of losing someone else. I realized then that I had been living as a meat sack long before I ever got to Sector 12. I had been a ghost, haunted by the memory of a lab fire I couldn't stop. The courage isn't in not being scared, Elara, I said, echoing a thought I hadn't voiced in years. It's in realizing that some things are worth the fear. I'd rather burn out in the atmosphere of a skip ship with you than live 1,000 years in this dark hole. She leaned in, resting her forehead against mine. Then we are two fools in a galaxy of logic, she whispered. Maybe, I said, kissing her through the thin transparency of her visor. But fools have more fun. Now get back to the lab. Be the perfect little scientist. I'm going to go see a man about a 5,000 credit cortex bypass. As she slipped back into the tunnel, her light fading into the darkness, I turned back to the viewport. The Ethelgard looked like a crown of thorns against the black. For the first time since I'd left Earth, I didn't feel like a technician fixing a machine. I felt like a man about to set a fire. 3 days later, the Ethelgard decided to prove me right about its structural integrity. I was back in Sector 12, elbow deep in the primary cooling manifold of Tank 54, when the world turned upside down. There was no explosion, just a sudden, bone-chilling groan of metal under extreme stress. Then the gravity simply quit. 1 second I was standing on the deck, and the next I was drifting in a cloud of frozen nitrogen and loose tools. The lights flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving the sector in a pitch blackness so thick it felt like it had physical weight. Vance, report! Silas's voice crackled through my comms, but it was garbled, distorted by a massive electromagnetic pulse. Loss of Singu chamber. Get out! The comms died with a burst of static that made my cortex link scream. I was floating in the dark, surrounded by the hiss of leaking fuel and the distant, muffled thud of emergency bulkheads slamming shut. My internal HUD was a mess of red icons. The station's primary singularity, the heart of the Ethelgard, had suffered a containment hiccup. I didn't think. I couldn't afford to. I reached for the emergency torch on my belt, but my fingers were numb with cold. I finally fumbled it open, the narrow beam of light cutting through the swirling H3 vapor. I had to get to the science wing. If the singularity was failing, the resonance lattice would be the first thing to spike. And if the lattice spiked while Elara was connected, I grabbed a handrail, using the lack of gravity to launch myself toward the main access shaft. I moved with a frantic, desperate grace, navigating the maze of pipes by memory and the thin beam of my torch. The air was getting thin, the life support systems having been knocked offline by the surge. I reached the Sector 10 transition lock, but the doors were dead. No power, no override. I pulled a manual pry bar from my belt and jammed it into the seal. I roared with effort, my muscles straining against the vacuum-sealed metal. On Earth, I would have failed. But in 0G, with adrenaline screaming through my veins, the door groaned and slid open a few inches. I squeezed through, my tunic tearing on the jagged edge of the lock. I emerged into a corridor that looked like a war zone. Holographic panels were shattered, sparks raining down from the ceiling like dying stars. Kaelen! I turned, my torch beam catching a figure huddled in an alcove. It wasn't Elara. It was a young ethel technician named Kiri, someone I'd seen in Lab 9. Her skin was a dull, terrified gray, and she was clutching a bleeding gash on her leg. The core, she stammered, her voice a thin trill of panic. It's collapsing. The high Arbiter. She stayed behind to stabilize the field. Which one? I shouted, grabbing her shoulders. Elara, is she still in the lab? Kiri nodded, her ears flat with terror. She said if the lattice went dark now, it would take the whole station with it. She's using herself as a bridge. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I sprinted, or rather launched myself down the corridor toward Lab 9. Every second felt like an hour. My lungs were burning, the recycled air tasting like ash. I burst into the lab, and for a second, I thought I was back in the singularity itself. The room was filled with a blinding, pulsing light, a kaleidoscope of every color I'd ever seen, and some I didn't have names for. Elara was at the center of it, her hands locked onto the primary resonator. Her skin wasn't just glowing, it was radiant, a blinding white that made the air around her shimmer with heat. Her eyes were closed, her face twisted in a mask of absolute agonizing concentration. The lattice was humming a frequency that made my very DNA feel like it was being unraveled. "Elara!" I yelled, the sound swallowed by the roar of the light. She didn't move. The feedback was killing her. I could see the tiny fractures appearing on her skin, the crystalline structures of her biology beginning to shatter under the load. I lunged forward, but a wave of kinetic energy threw me back against a console. The lattice was protecting itself, creating a localized gravity well that was pulling everything toward the center. I looked at the primary power coupling. If I could just break the circuit, the feedback would stop. But the coupling was under 5,000 volts of live lethal energy. If I touched it with a standard tool, I'd be vaporized. I looked at my hands covered in grease and old scars. I thought about the lab fire on Earth. I had stood outside that door, paralyzed by the heat, listening to the screams, too scared to move until it was too late. I had spent 5 years telling myself that I was just a man of tools, that I wasn't built for the big moments. Not this time. I grabbed the heavy-duty copper bypass wire I'd been hiding in my kit for the skip ship theft. I wrapped one end around a grounded support beam and the other around my mag wrench. It was a suicide play, a 500-to-1 shot. I looked at Elara, her light beginning to fade, her body sagging against the resonator. "I'm sorry, Elara," I whispered, "but you're not the only one who can be a bridge." I lunged forward, diving through the wall of light. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't heat, it was the sensation of being turned inside out, of every memory and every fear being stripped away by the raw power of the lattice. I saw the fire on Earth. I saw the face of the woman I'd failed. I saw the cold, empty years I'd spent in the dark. And then I saw Elara. Not as a scientist or an alien, but as a soul that was just as scared and just as lonely as I was. I slammed the wrench into the coupling. There was a sound like the universe being torn in half, a blinding flash of white, and then silence. The gravity returned with a bone-jarring thud. I hit the floor hard, the air driven from my lungs. The lab was in ruins, the light replaced by a thick, heavy smoke. I coughed, my vision swimming, my hands feeling like they were on fire. I crawled through the wreckage, my fingers searching for her. I found her near the resonator, her light almost completely gone. She was cold, so cold. "Elara," I gasped, pulling her into my lap. "Talk to me, please." Her eyes fluttered open, the amethyst dim and cloudy. "Kaelen," she whispered, her voice a fragile ghost of itself. You broke the harmony." "I had to," I said, my voice breaking. "You were dying." She reached up, her trembling fingers touching my face. Her skin flared a weak, beautiful rose. "You saw it, didn't you? The lattice? It showed you." "I saw everything," I said, tears blurring my vision. "And I'm still here." She managed a tiny, heartbreaking smile. "You are a very stubborn variable, Kaelen Vance." We sat there in the ruins of the lab, surrounded by the smell of burnt circuits and the distant sound of emergency crews finally breaking through the bulkheads. The station was stabilizing, the singularity having been reset by the surge. But as the lights flickered back to life, I saw Agent Thorne standing in the doorway. He wasn't alone. 6 peacekeepers with drawn pulse rifles stood behind him. He looked at the wreckage, and then at us, his eyes as cold as the void. "Well, Vance," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr, "it seems you've managed to save the station. A pity you had to destroy the most valuable piece of technology in the quadrant to do it." He stepped into the room, his boots crunching on the glass. "I'm afraid the purity recalibration can no longer be delayed. For either of you." I held Elara tighter, my burned hands stinging with every breath. I looked at Thorne, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like running. I had seen the worst of myself in that light, and I had come out the other side. The courage wasn't in the absence of fear. It was in what you did while you were shaking. "You're too late, Thorne," I said, my voice steady and hard as the hull of a ship. "You can take the lab, you can take the lattice, but you're never going to get the signal back, because the signal isn't in the machine. Thorne narrowed his eyes. And where is it, technician? I looked at Elara, and she looked at me, her skin beginning to glow with a soft, defiant azure that no machine could ever replicate. It's in the static, I said. And you're not invited to the conversation. As the peacekeepers moved in, I didn't look at their guns. I looked at the woman in my arms, and I knew that no matter what happened next, the darkness would never be quite as cold again. The null chamber was not a room of darkness. It was a room of absolute suffocating neutrality. The walls were a matte, featureless gray that seemed to absorb any sound I made, and the light was a flat, shadowless white that felt like it was trying to bleach the memories right out of my skull. There was no bed, no chair, and no sense of time. Just the humming of the station's life support, which felt like a distant taunt from a world I no longer belonged to. I sat on the floor, my back against the vibrating hull. My hands were wrapped in sterile gauze, the burns from the resonance lattice still throbbing with a dull, rhythmic heat. Every few minutes, my Cortex link would attempt to ping the station's local mesh, only to be met with a cold, digital wall that sent a sharp spike of static through my nervous system. I was zeroed out, ghosted by the very systems I had spent 5 years keeping alive. The door hissed open without a sound. Agent Thorne stepped inside, looking as if he had just stepped off a recruitment poster for the Hegemony's internal security division. His uniform was crisp, his eyes were clear, and he carried a tablet that likely contained the sum total of my failures. "You look like hell, Vance," he said, his voice carrying that same smooth, predatory calm. "I've had better shifts," I replied, my voice raspy and dry. "How is she?" Thorne sat down on the floor opposite me, a gesture of faux intimacy that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Vaughn is being processed for a full neural reset. Her light is fractured, as I told you. The Council believes that the contamination has reached her core. They are going to purge the erratic variables, meaning your influence, and restore her to her optimal state of logical efficiency." My heart felt like it was being squeezed by a hydraulic press. "You can't do that. It'll kill who she is. She'll be a shell. She will be a productive member of Ethel society," Thorne countered, his eyes narrowing, "which is more than can be said for you. You are currently facing 20 counts of sabotage, unauthorized access to classified research, and the destruction of high-level hegemony property. In any other sector, you'd be spaced without a trial." "Then why am I still breathing?" I asked, leaning forward despite the ache in my chest. "You want something? The lattice is dead, isn't it?" Thorne didn't answer immediately. He looked at the tablet, his fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the glass. "The lattice is not dead. It is dormant. It has locked itself into a feedback loop that our best scientists cannot break. It seems it has developed a preference for your specific biosignature. It won't reactivate without you." I let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "So you need the spark chaser after all. You need the contaminant to start the machine. I need you to fix what you broke, Vance. Do that, and I can guarantee a stay of execution for Dr. Vaughn. She won't be reset. She will be transferred to a research facility on the homeworld. She'll be safe. She'll be away from you, yes, but she will be whole." I stared at him, my mind racing through 100 different scenarios. It was the same old fear, the same old trap. On Earth, I had stayed outside the fire because I was scared of failing. Now Thorne was offering me a way to save her life by destroying everything she believed in. He was asking me to be the coward one more time, to choose the safety of a silent life over the danger of a loud one. "You're lying," I said, my voice steadying. "You'll use me to prime the weapon, and then you'll scrap us both once the signal is locked. I've seen how the hegemony handles surplus parts." Thorne sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "You humans are so obsessed with the drama of the individual. You don't see the architecture of the whole. This station, this research, it is the only way to ensure stability across 3 systems. If that requires the sacrifice of 2 insignificant sparks, so be it. But I am giving you a choice, Kaelen. Be the hero who saves her life, or be the fool who watches her mind get wiped to a blank slate." He stood up, the door sliding open behind him. "You have 6 hours to decide. If you aren't in Lab 9 by 2400 hours, the reset procedure begins." He left me there in the white silence. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, heavier than the gravity of Sector 12. I thought about Elara's skin, the way it had flared that beautiful, defiant azure when we kissed. I thought about the way she had looked at me in the ruins of the lab, knowing she was dying but refusing to let go of the harmony we had found. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall. I was terrified, more terrified than I had been in the fire, more terrified than I had been in the singularity, because this time, the fire was inside me. But as I sat there, I felt a tiny, almost imperceptible vibration through the hull. It wasn't the rhythmic throb of the engines. It was a series of taps, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. It was the old human emergency code, the kind they taught us in basic maintenance training before the Cortex links became standard. It was coming from the cooling pipes inside the wall. I pressed my ear to the metal. The taps stopped, and then a new sequence began. VANCE SECTOR TWELVE WAITING. Silas. The old gearhead was using the station's own resonance against itself. He was tapping into the primary coolant lines, sending vibrations through the entire substructure of the null chamber. I felt a sudden, sharp surge of hope. Thorne and his high-level suits thought they owned the station because they held the keys to the spire. But they didn't know the bones of this place. They didn't know the men and women who lived in the grease and the dark, the ones who heard the whispers of the machines. I tapped back against the pipe using the metal tip of my gauze-wrapped thumb. INONEHOUR. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a wrench. All I had was a desperate, irrational courage and the knowledge that I wasn't alone in the dark. I stood up, my legs shaky but my resolve hardening into something like the reinforced steel of the hull. The Hegemony wanted me to fix their machine. I was going to fix it, all right. I was going to tear the whole damn thing down. The courage wasn't about not being scared of Thorne or the reset. It was about acting even when I knew the odds were zero. It was about being the glitch in their perfect system. I looked at the shadowless white light of the room and smiled. I had 6 hours. In my world, that was enough time to rebuild an engine from scratch or start a revolution. The wait was the hardest part. Every minute felt like a light year, the silence of the room amplifying the pounding of my heart. I counted the seconds, the minutes, until the chronometer in my head hit the mark. 59 minutes. 60. Exactly 1 hour after the message, the lights in the null chamber didn't just flicker. They died. A secondary surge of electromagnetic interference, courtesy of Silas and whatever black market pulse generator he'd whipped up in the fuel depots, slammed into the local grid. The magnetic locks on the door groaned and failed. I didn't wait for them to reset. I slammed my shoulder into the metal, the door sliding open just enough for me to squeeze through. The corridor was a chaos of emergency strobes and shouting peacekeepers. I didn't head for the lifts. I headed for the disposal chutes. I had spent years maintaining those gravity-fed tubes, and I knew exactly where they led. I dove into the chute, the sudden drop stomach-churning as I slid down 3 levels in a matter of seconds. I landed in a pile of discarded bioplastics and scrap metal in the heart of Sector 10. "Vance, over here!" Silas was standing near a service hatch, holding a pulse rifle that looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts. He was flanked by 3 other humans from the fuel depots and a young ethel technician with bright, defiant orange skin. "You look like a piece of junk that's been through a trash compactor, kid," Silas grunted, his eyes twinkling with a grim amusement. "You're a beautiful sight, Silas," I said, pulling myself out of the scrap pile. "Did you bring my tools?" The old man tossed me a heavy, familiar bag. "Everything you need to break a station, and a few things to put it back together." "Where is Elara?" I asked, checking the charge on my mag wrench. "They moved her to the science bridge in Sector 1, the ethel technician said. Her skin was a shimmering, agitated gold. "They are preparing the final synchronization. If we don't get there in 45 minutes, she is gone." "Then we'd better stop talking and start moving," I said. "We're going through the primary atmospheric vents," Silas whistled. "Those vents are hard-decked with motion sensors and automated turrets. We'll be target practice before we hit the second bend." Not if we turn off the sensors, I said, a dark grin spreading across my face. I know a guy who's very good at making things lag. We moved through the shadows of the station, a small, ragtag army of the unwanted and the overlooked. We were technicians, fuel rats, and spark chasers, and for the first time in the history of the Ethel Guard, we were the ones holding the wrenches. As we climbed into the dark, echoing cavern of the atmospheric vents, I felt the fear chilling my blood. I knew we might not make it. I knew I might lose her anyway. But as I looked at the determined faces of the people around me, I realized that this was what Elara had been talking about. This was the resonance. It wasn't a weapon. It was the sound of people choosing to be more than the variables they were assigned. We weren't just running for us anymore. We were the static in the hegemony's perfect signal, and we were about to get very, very loud. The atmospheric vents were a labyrinth of spinning turbine blades and freezing air currents that smelled of recycled lungs and ancient ozone. It was a space designed for machines, not for men with bleeding hands and a desperate clock ticking in their heads. We moved in a single file, our footsteps muffled by the roar of the wind, our only light the dim blue glow of our HUDs. "Keep your heads down," I shouted over the gale. "The next junction has an automated sentry. If it gets a lock on us, we're done for." We reached the junction, a massive circular chamber where 4 primary vents converged. High above us, the sentry turret hummed with a predatory energy, its red optical sensor sweeping the darkness in a slow, rhythmic arc. "Silas, give me the pulse gen," I whispered. The old man handed me a small, boxy device that vibrated with a low-frequency thrum. I crawled forward, my stomach flat against the cold metal of the vent floor. I had to time this perfectly. If I tripped the sensor before the pulse hit, the station would be on full lockdown within 10 seconds. I watched the red light sweep past me. 1, 2, 3, now! I slammed the pulse gen onto the primary power conduit. A blue spark erupted from the device, and the sentry turret let out a dying whine, its red eye flickering out as the local circuit fried. "Go! Go! Go!" We scrambled across the chamber, our boots clattering on the metal grating. We had 30 minutes left. The air was getting thinner as we climbed higher into the station's superstructure, the pressure differential making my ears pop and my lungs ache. We reached a reinforced access hatch that led directly into the science bridge. I checked the schematic on my tablet. This was the moment of truth. Beyond this door was the heart of the hegemony's power, and the woman who had rewritten the stars for me. Kaelen, the ethel technician, Kiri, said, her skin a soft, anxious lavender. "The security on the other side will be heavy. Thorn won't just be waiting with a tablet this time." "I know," I said, tightening the strap of my toolkit. "Silas, you and the others take the secondary corridors. Create as much noise as you can. Blow the environmental regulators, trip the fire alarms, do whatever it takes to pull their attention away from the central dais." "You got it, kid," Silas said, checking the charge on his makeshift rifle. "Try not to get yourself killed. I still owe you 50 credits from that poker game in Sector 12. I'll be there to collect, I promised." We split up, Silas and his crew disappearing into the dark recesses of the maintenance tunnels. I was left with Kiri. She looked at me, her ears perking up in a gesture of silent respect. "Why are you doing this, Kaelen?" she asked. "You are human. You could have stayed in the fuel depots and survived. Why risk everything for one of us?" I looked at the hatch, my reflection in the dark metal, looking older and more tired than I felt. "Because she's not one of you, Kiri. She's just Elara. And in a universe this big and this cold, finding someone who makes you feel like you aren't just a part in a machine is worth everything, including the risk." Kiri nodded slowly, her skin shifting to a bright, determined orange. "Then let's go find her." I jammed the override key into the hatch. The locks hissed open, and we stepped into a world of blinding light and clinical perfection. The science bridge was a cathedral of glass and holographic displays, overlooking the swirling violet nebula of the Veils. At the center of the room was the primary resonance lattice, its silver threads glowing with a sickly, pulsing amber light. Elara was strapped into the central dais, her skin a flat, lifeless gray, her eyes open but vacant. A series of neural links were attached to her temples, feeding a steady stream of data directly into her brain. Thorn was standing over her, his hand on the primary control console. He didn't look surprised to see me. 23 minutes early, Vance, he said, his voice echoing in the vast, sterile space. I underestimated your resourcefulness and your stupidity. Let her go, Thorn, I said, my voice cold and hard. The station is crawling with alarms. Your security is busy chasing shadows in the sublevels. You've lost? Thorn smiled, a thin, cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. I haven't lost anything. The synchronization is at 98%. Once the final gate opens, the signal will be locked. Even if you kill me, the broadcast will continue. It is an autonomous loop now. He gestured to the lattice. Look at her, Kaelen. She is finally perfect. No fear, no doubt, no irrational attachments. She is the bridge we were promised. I looked at Elara, and my heart shattered. She looked like a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the woman I loved. The Hegemony hadn't just taken her freedom, they had taken her light. I didn't think about the guards. I didn't think about the pulse rifles. I just ran. I lunged for the dais, but a blast of kinetic energy threw me back. Two peacekeepers stepped out from behind the holographic displays, their weapons leveled at my chest. Stay back, Vance, Thorn commanded. You are the catalyst, remember? Your presence here is only making the signal stronger. You are helping us finish the weapon. I looked at the lattice and then at Elara. He was right. I could feel the hum of the machine in my bones, a rhythmic, pulsing frequency that felt like my own heartbeat being mirrored back at me. My love for her, my fear for her, it was all being harvested, fed into the machine to create the very weapon I was trying to stop. I was the variable that made the equation work. The realization hit me with the force of a supernova. All this time, I had been trying to fix things, to build bridges, to save what I could. But in this world, my humanity was the fuel for their cruelty. The more I felt, the stronger the weapon became. The courage wasn't in fighting the guards. It wasn't in breaking the locks. It was in knowing when to let go. Kaelen, Kiri's voice whispered in my ear. She had slipped into the shadows, her hands hovering over a secondary terminal. I can't break the neural link. It's hardwired into her core. But I can invert the resonance. What does that mean? I asked, my eyes locked on Elara. It means instead of the lattice taking from you, it gives to her. It's a feedback loop, but it will burn out the cortex link in your head. It will fry your nervous system, Kaelen. You won't make it. I looked at Elara. Her eyes were still vacant, but her skin gave a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of blue. Do it, I said. Vance, what are you doing? Thorn shouted, sensing the shift in the air. I ignored him. I stepped forward, not toward the guards, but toward the light. I opened my mind, my heart, everything I had spent years trying to hide. I thought about the snow in Maine. I thought about the smell of her skin. I thought about the way she laughed when I told her a bad joke. I poured every ounce of my broken, messy, human self into the space between us. The lattice screamed. The amber light turned a brilliant, blinding azure. The threads began to vibrate so fast they became a blur. I felt a sudden, sharp pain at the base of my skull, a white-hot agony that felt like a needle being driven into my brain. My cortex link was melting. Kaelen! The voice wasn't a whisper. It was a roar. Elara's eyes snapped into focus. Her skin erupted into a blinding, incandescent white that filled the entire bridge. The neural links shattered, the silver threads of the lattice snapping like violin strings. The shock wave threw Thorn and the guards across the room. The holographic displays exploded in a shower of sparks. The silence that followed was absolute. I fell to my knees, my vision swimming in a sea of gray. I couldn't feel my arms. I couldn't feel the floor. Everything was fading into the static. But then I felt her. Cool, silken hands cupped my face. A smell like ozone and warm sunlight filled my senses. I've got you, Kaelen, she whispered, her voice a melody that cut through the darkness. I've got you. I forced my eyes open. Elara was kneeling in front of me, her skin a soft, steady, beautiful blue. The weapon was gone. The lattice was a pile of melted silver. You're back, I gasped, my voice barely a breath. We're both back, she said, her amethyst eyes shining with tears of light. But the moment didn't last. The station's emergency sirens began to wail, a high-pitched, frantic scream. The primary singularity was destabilizing again, but this time, there was no one left to hold it together. "The Hegemony has initiated a self-destruct sequence," Kiri shouted, emerging from the ruins of the terminal. "We have 10 minutes to get to the escape pods." I tried to stand, but my legs buckled. My nervous system was a wreck, the burnt-out cortex link a dead weight in my skull. "Leave me," I said, looking at Elara. "You can make it. Kiri can get you to the pods." Elara looked at me, and for the first time there was no logic in her eyes. Only a fierce, unyielding love. "I spent my whole life being efficient, Kaelen," she said, sliding her arm under mine and pulling me up with a strength I didn't know she had. "I think I'm ready to be a little bit reckless." We stumbled through the crumbling corridors of the science bridge, the station groaning and buckling around us. Silas and his crew met us at the junction, their faces grim but their spirits high. "The skip ship is in berth 7, Silas shouted over the roar of the collapsing bulkheads. "We've already hot-wired the engines." We ran. We ran through the smoke, through the sparks, through the fear. I was barely conscious, my world reduced to the sound of Elara's breathing and the feel of her hand in mine. We reached the berth just as the primary containment field failed. The ethel guard began to tear itself apart, the massive metal rings twisting like ribbons in the wind. We scrambled into the skip ship, a sleek silver bird of a vessel that looked like it was made for the stars. Silas slammed the hatch shut, and the engines roared to life with a frequency that felt like a promise. We cleared the station just as it collapsed into a point of infinite darkness. The explosion wasn't a sound. It was a ripple in the fabric of space that sent us tumbling through the void. I lay on the floor of the cockpit, watching the stars through the viewport. They were bright, so bright. "We made it," I whispered. Elara sat down beside me, her skin glowing a soft, contented violet. "We made it, Kaelen." I looked at her, and I realized that the courage hadn't been in the escape. It hadn't been in the fight. It had been in the choice to be vulnerable, to let someone else in even when you knew it could break you. I wasn't a spark chaser anymore. I was just a man. And for the first time in 5 years, that was enough. As we drifted into the deep black of the veils, away from the hegemony and the ghosts of the past, I realized that the universe wasn't a machine to be fixed. It was a song to be sung, and we were finally finding the harmony. The skip ship, a stolen piece of hegemony engineering named the Vindicator, drifted through the silent shroud of the veils like a wounded predator seeking a place to die. Inside, the air was thin, tasting of recycled sweat in the sharp, lingering bite of electrical fire. The hum of the engines was a low, jagged vibration that felt wrong, unbalanced like a heart beating out of time. I was lying on a makeshift cot in the cramped engineering bay, my head propped up by a bundle of oily rags. The silence was the loudest thing in the room. For 5 years, the cortex link at the base of my brain had provided a constant, digital white noise, a stream of status reports, sensor data, and station pings that acted as a secondary nervous system. Now there was nothing. The link was a charred piece of silicon buried in my skull, a dead weight that had left me unplugged. For the first time in my adult life, the world felt heavy, sluggish. I had to manually blink my eyes to clear the moisture. I had to manually listen to the rhythmic wheeze of the life support fans. It was terrifying being trapped inside the organic cage of my own body without a HUD to tell me if I was dying. "You're staring at the bulkhead again, Kay," a voice rasped. I turned my head slowly. The movement sent a dull ache through my neck. Silas was sitting on a crate of spare parts, cleaning the grime off his knuckles with a piece of sandpaper. He looked ancient in the dim emergency lighting, his skin like parched earth. "Just trying to remember how to breathe without a computer telling me my oxygen saturation?" I grunted. My voice sounded deeper to my own ears, more resonant. Silas chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Welcome back to the world of the living, kid. We used to do everything manually before the hegemony started handing out those brain stems like candy. You'll get used to the lag. It makes the coffee taste better when you have to wait for your brain to realize it's hot." "How is she?" I asked, the only question that mattered. "She's in the cockpit with Kiri," Silas said, his expression softening. "The kid is helping her stabilize. Her light took a hell of a hit when you fried the lattice. She's, she's flickering, Kay, like a neon sign in a rainstorm. But she's awake. Asked about you 3 times in the last hour. I told her you were too stubborn to kick the bucket over a little neural burnout. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. And the others? 6 humans and 4 ethel made it onto the ship before the boom, Silas said, leaning back. The rest, well, they didn't make the cut. We're a skeleton crew on a ship that's one bad sneeze away from falling apart. But we're out. The Hegemony has their hands full trying to explain how their prize station turned into a localized black hole. They won't be chasing us into the Veils. Not yet. I closed my eyes, the image of Ethelgard collapsing into itself, flickering behind my eyelids. It wasn't the station I saw. It was the fire on Earth. The screams I hadn't answered. For 5 years, I had convinced myself that being a technician, a man of tools and logic, meant I didn't have to feel the weight of those failures. I had used the Cortex link as a shield, a way to quantify my life so I didn't have to live it. But in the science bridge, I had chosen the fire. I had dived into the agony of the lattice not because it was logical, but because Elara was there. I had traded my safety for her light. Silas, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Did I break it? The signal? The old man looked at me, his eyes reflecting the amber glow of the console. You didn't just break the signal, kid. You broke the frequency. The Hegemony can build another station. They can weave another lattice, but they'll never be able to bottle what happened in that lab. You showed them that a human's grit and an ethel's light aren't just variables. They're a goddamn explosion. He stood up, his joints popping with the sound of small arms fire. Get some sleep. We're 3 days out from Orizon. It's a moon on the edge of the neutral territories. No Hegemony, no peacekeepers. Just a lot of dirt in a sky that doesn't close. He left me alone then, the silence of the ship closing in. But as I lay there, feeling the raw, unbuffered ache of my own existence, the door to the bay hissed open. A soft, azure glow filled the room. Elara stepped inside, her silver gown torn and gray with soot. Her skin was translucent, the blue light within her pulsing in a slow, tired rhythm. Her ears were slightly drooped, but when she saw me, they perked up with a surge of rose-colored warmth. She didn't say a word. She simply crossed the room and sat on the edge of my cot. When she took my hand, the touch felt electric, not because of the ethel energy, but because I could feel the texture of her skin, the subtle ridges of her fingerprints, the warmth of her dual hearts. Without the cortex link to filter the sensation, it was overwhelming. It was real. Kaelen, she whispered, her voice a melody of relief and sorrow. Your mind, it is so quiet now. It's a bit lonely in here, I admitted, my thumb tracing the back of her hand. But I can hear you better. She leaned down, her forehead resting against mine. Her skin flared a bright, brilliant sapphire, and for a moment I felt the resonance again, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. It was a messy, beautiful tangle of her fear and my hope, her intellect and my stubbornness. The lattice tried to show me that we were separate, she said, her breath smelling of star fruit and ozone. It tried to tell me that love was a malfunction in the code, but when you touched the coupling, when you poured yourself into the static, I realized that the malfunction is the only part of the code that matters. I pulled her closer, the weight of her body against mine feeling like the only thing keeping me from drifting away. I'm not a hero, Elara. I'm just a guy who realized that the fire is better than the cold. Then we shall be warm together, she said. We stayed like that for a long time. 2 broken pieces of a universe that had tried to keep us apart, drifting through the dark on a stolen ship. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of the sound of manual reality, of hearts beating, lungs breathing, and the quiet, defiant pulse of a love that didn't need a signal to be heard. Orizon was not a beautiful world. It was a rugged, half-terraformed moon orbiting a gas giant that looked like a bruised orange. The sky was a hazy violet, and the air had a sharp mineral tang that made your nose sting. But as the Vindicator touched down on the dusty landing pad of the settlement, it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It had been 11 days since the destruction of Ethelgard. My body was still adjusting to the lack of a cortex link. I felt clumsy, my movements lacking the digitized precision I had relied on for a decade. My speech was slower, my thoughts more wandering. But as I stepped off the ramp and felt the crunch of actual dirt beneath my boots, I realized I didn't care. The settlement was a collection of modular habitats and repurposed freighter hulls, home to about 400 refugees, miners, and outcasts. There were no gleaming spires here, no polished glass, no hidden cameras. Just the sound of wind whipping through the crystalline canyons and the distant hum of a water purifier that needed a new gasket. "Vance, get a move on," Silas shouted, tossing a heavy pack to Kiri. "We've got 3 hours of daylight left, and I'm not sleeping in a pressurized tin can another night." I watched them, humans and Ethel working side by side to unload the ship. There was no hierarchy here, no purity recalibrations, just the shared necessity of survival. I saw Kiri showing a human miner how to bypass a faulty relay using ethel resonance, their skin glowing a collaborative shade of orange. I felt a hand slide into mine. Elara was standing beside me, wearing a rugged technician's jumpsuit she'd scavenged from the ship's lockers. Her skin was a steady, healthy azure, reflecting the violet light of the orison sky. She looked less like a high arbiter and more like a woman who had finally found her own orbit. "It is very loud here," she said, her ears twitching at the sound of a distant rock drill. "But the geometry is honest." "It's a start," I said. Over the next few months, the spark chaser became the builder. I didn't just fix things anymore. I helped create them. I spent my days in the heat of the canyons, laying power lines and repairing the settlement's aging infrastructure. My hands became even more calloused, my face lined by the orison sun. Without the cortex link, every repair was a puzzle I had to solve with my own intuition and the feel of the metal. It was frustrating, it was exhausting, and it was the most satisfying work I had ever done. I didn't run when the water recycler blew a seal. I didn't hide in the dark when a dust storm threatened to bury the colony. I stayed. I fought. I felt every moment of the struggle. One evening, after a long shift in the mines, I sat on the porch of our small habitat, watching the gas giant rise over the horizon. The rings of Orison's mother planet were a halo of frozen light, spanning the entire sky. Elara came out to join me, carrying 2 mugs of synthesized coffee. Black, 2 sugars. She sat down, her skin shifting to a deep, contemplative indigo. We sat in silence for a long time, just listening to the wind and the distant voices of the settlement. "I was thinking about the fire today," I said softly. Elara turned to me, her amethyst eyes searching mine. "Which one?" "Both," I said. "On Earth, I thought the fire was the end. I thought if I stayed away from the heat, I'd be safe. I built walls of logic and silicon to keep the world out. But on Ethelgard, when I saw you in that light, I realized that being safe is just a polite way of being dead." I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter, hot, and perfect. "The fire didn't destroy me, Elara. It just burned away the parts of me that weren't real. It left the grease, the scars, and the static. And for the first time in my life, I'm okay with that." Elara leaned her head on my shoulder, her skin glowing with a warmth that felt like home. "We are all made of stardust and friction, Kaelen. Without the friction, there is no heat. And without the heat, there is no life. I would rather be a flickering spark in this canyon than a perfect sun in the high citadel." I looked out at the settlement, at the small lights burning in the windows of the habitats. I thought about the thousands of people across the galaxy who were still living under the shadow of the hegemony, their lives quantified and controlled, their hearts buffered by the same silence I had lived in. I realized then that the courage to be vulnerable wasn't just about love. It was about the willingness to exist in a world you couldn't control. It was about the bravery required to be a manual human in a digital universe. I spent most of my life thinking that my job was to fix the machines around me, never realizing that I was the one with the stripped bolts and the leaking seals. I thought that by plugging my brain into the station's grid, I was making myself better, faster, more efficient. I was chasing a version of myself that didn't have to hurt, didn't have to fear, and didn't have to remember the weight of a lost home. But looking back at the long, humming corridors of the Ethelgard and the blinding white agony of the lattice, I see the truth now. The efficiency was a lie. The silence was a prison. It was the malfunctions. The stutter in my heart when Elara smiled, the the shaking of my hands when the alarm screamed, the illogical choice to dive into a live power coupling that actually saved us. I'm not the man I was on Earth, and I'm certainly not the technician the hegemony trained me to be. I am a man who can no longer see the world through a digital HUD, and that is my greatest strength. My scars are the only blueprints I need now. They remind me that I am capable of breaking, and more importantly, that I am capable of being put back together by something as simple as a touch or a whispered word. We spend so much time trying to bridge the gap between stars, forgetting that the most important bridge is the one we build between ourselves, one awkward, manual, terrifying step at a time. I spent 5 years hiding in the static because I was afraid of the signal. I thought that if I stayed unplugged from my own emotions, I could never be broken again. I wonder, in your own life, what are the walls you've built to keep the fire away? What are the parts of yourself you've labeled as malfunctions, just because they make you feel something you can't control? I stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, and offered my hand to Elara. She took it, her skin flaring a brilliant, hopeful rose as we walked together into the cool violet night. Behind us, the coffee sat on the table, two simple cups of black liquid, cooling in the manual air of a world we had chosen for ourselves.